Hello, everybody. We're just going to take a minute for folks to be able to join. Thanks so much for taking a little time. I hope that you are doing well. Bear with me another 30 seconds or so, and we'll go ahead and get started. Hope everybody's staying safe out there. It's a cloudy and chilly day in South Bend, but also thankful for the ability to be home. Chas and I are spending a lot of time together and making sure that those we love and care about and those in our community are okay as well. And I hope that you're able to do the same. Let's take maybe one more minute and hopefully the quality is coming through. Very good. As you know, Chasten is an expert at Instagram live programming. I am still catching up on how to do it yourself, but I think we're going to have a great conversation today. So I'm glad that you're able to join. I am now going to go ahead and bring in General McChrystal, who we're going to have a great conversation with shortly. All right, General, are you able to see us all right?
I can, Mayor Pete. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thanks so much for making time for the conversation.
Well, and call me Stan, please.
I'll try. That's a hard habit to form for a former lieutenant like myself. But
I'm sure you can get it.
so, for those who are just joining us, I'm joined by retired General Stan McChrystal, somebody who was a pivotal figure in the conflicts after 9/11 and in modern American military history. He and I were both serving in Afghanistan with a considerable difference. I was responsible for a small branch of a small unit. He was responsible for the entire coalition war effort. And now, in his private capacity at the McChrystal Group, has been having a lot of conversations about both specific tactical issues that are relevant in the era of the pandemic, and more broadly, things that are going on in our country and in our world that bear on the question of leadership. That is something that certainly every military officer thinks a lot about, and that I think all of Americans are thinking about right now. A few days ago, we had the pleasure of being on Morning Joe together, and it gave us the idea of coming together here on Instagram with a little bit more time to really explore these topics in a conversation. So I'm so appreciative that you've taken some time. We got over 1,000 questions when we let the internet know that we were going to be speaking. And so I'm mostly going to be sharing these questions that came in from folks. I'll try to pick some up that are coming in the comments too. But I want to start with one of my own, which I imagine you'd have some perspective on. So many people are talking about this crisis in an analogy to war, maybe because the only thing that we can think of in modern history that has been as sudden and as dramatic with as profound impacts as this pandemic are major wars. And as somebody who has thought about history and as somebody who knows war well, I wonder what your views are on how well that analogy works or what it might miss to try to use that vocabulary. Everything from the president describing himself as a wartime president to the UN Secretary General saying that the world's not faced an issue as challenging as this since World War II. In what ways do you think this is like a military conflict, and what are the limits of using that kind of imagery to understand what we're faced with right now as a country and as a human species?
Well, it's a great question. If you think of combat, you think of battles, and those are between military forces. But when you think of wars, you think of wars between nations or groups of nations. I do think that the analogy to a war against COVID-19 is appropriate if we think in terms of an effort against an existential crisis. Literally, COVID-19 is a threat to the globe, to every citizen of the world. It's a viral, amorphous, opportunistic threat, goes where we don't expect it in many cases, goes where we're weakest or not prepared, and requires a full of society approach. So when we think about it, it's not lining up a few soldiers and shooting the virus. It's getting our social programs right. It's getting our politics right. It's getting our economy right. It's getting all the pieces, not just right but working together. That's the hard part about war. If we think about history, they asked Napoleon which enemy he would most like to fight. And he replied, a coalition. Because rarely could coalitions have the unity to be as effective as they needed to be. What we need to do when we think of the United States is not be 50 separate states or countless municipalities. We need to be one entity that's united, that's sharing information, that's sharing resources, that's sharing expertise, that's focusing, that's taking care of each other. And we actually need to think about that globally, because you don't beat COVID-19 in one place until it's beaten everywhere. You don't really win.
So one of the challenges there that I think we're confronting is the fact that we're struggling when it comes to coordination. Certainly among countries, a lot of recriminations going back and forth between the U.S., China, and other countries around the world that we'll have to find some ways to cooperate, I think, in order to tackle this threat. But also right here in the United States, where it sounds like we have a president sometimes contradicting governors, governors not on the same page as each other, governors not always listening to mayors, which as a former mayor, I think is never a good idea to ignore what the leader of a community has to say. What do you think are steps that need to happen at a time like this in order to make sure that we do act like a well-functioning coalition and not like the kind that the likes of Napoleon would be very eager to contend with?
Yeah, I think first it has to come from us. We as citizens have got to be demanding. And so what do we want to demand of our leaders? I think the first thing we need to demand from our leaders is candor. Tell us the situation as best you know it to be. Now that can change as information changes, and will often be that way. But be very direct with us, because not only can we take it, we deserve it and we need it. The second thing is we need leaders who will take responsibility. Leaders are in position. They may not have dealt the cards that they hold in their hands, but they are the people that we've elected and given those cards to. We've asked them to accept the responsibility as leaders. And then they can ask us to do things, and we as citizens should do that. But leaders should stand up and be responsible. The next thing leaders need to do is coordinate amongst each other, collaborate. That means you got to give a bit. That means compromise. A coalition, think of what Dwight David Eisenhower did with the forces fighting against Nazi Germany. He had to deal with some big personalities that were difficult and different equities on the part of the forces. So we had to give a bit. You don't get a bad solution. You get a solution that ultimately works, although it may not be exactly what any entity wants to do. And finally, I think our leaders should inspire us. Now, not every leader is as eloquent as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Abraham Lincoln, so we can't expect them all to be soaring orators. But what we can do is ask them to put an eye on the far ridgeline, to tell us this is where we're going, this is what we are going to be. I think we should demand that of our leaders. When we don't get it, we should push back. And I think we should push back pretty directly.
Well, and that's, I think, an obligation that we have as citizens to speak up when our leadership is not serving us well. And of course, that's one of the things that's at stake every day, but in particular in the context of an election. And this is an election year where we're seeing the very mechanics of the election come into question. You know, one thing that is certainly not novel or exotic for anyone who served overseas is mail-in voting. Do you think that it's desirable, and do you think it's practicable for us to extend that nationwide? And what are some things to think about, whether it's specific to voting or more broadly to preserving our democracy in order to make sure that the American people do have a say on our local and state and national leaders in this critical year?
Yeah. I personally think that every eligible American needs to vote, and we need to make it as easy as possible. Mail-in or digital voting, we ought to be able to figure that out. I personally, and I go out on a limb because a lot of people don't agree, I think voting should be mandatory. I think every eligible voter should have to go and vote. Now, they could vote for nobody. There should be a thing that says, I don't want to name a person. But the reason is voter suppression works against the very idea of democracy. It shouldn't be who's not busy that day or who's most excited about it. We got to get the sense of what the nation wants. Now, the nation citizens then have a responsibility to educate themselves. As Tocqueville showed us, an educated electorate is key to this. But the reality is, I think, my family's from the South. My mother's family's from the Deep South. And my mother was a great believer in equity and civil rights and taught my family that. But there was such a tradition of voter suppression, and we ought to be long past that.
One of the things I always think about from the deployment is when an election day came and Afghans had that purple ink on their fingers. There was a simple but effective way of making sure that somebody could only vote once. Even when word had gone out in certain districts that the Taliban would be seeking out anybody who had revealed themselves to be a voter with that finger, and that they would be subject to violence if they'd taken that act of voting. And then you look at the voter turnout rates right here in the United States, where voting couldn't be more different than what the Afghans faced. And it does raise that question of why we can't expect that every American will exercise that right, and of course that every American will be able to exercise that right. You mentioned that voter suppression is unfortunately alive and well in many parts of the country. And one concern I have, even with vote by mail, that is clearly a step that we could take that would make it a lot easier for many people to vote, is that if we go that route, let's make sure that we also continue to seek safe means for in-person voting, and or make sure that vote by mail doesn't make it easier for things like the purging of rolls that has sometimes been done in a way that's had a racially disparate impact to disenfranchise voters. The goal's got to be to make sure that every eligible citizen can vote, not to make it harder for anybody. I want to come back to a little more of this territory about the pandemic response and how a military background might offer insight on that. In particular, because I know you and your colleagues at the McChrystal group have discussed the concept of fusion cells. This is something that was a model that I worked in when I was deployed, was connected to a very small body of people who were able to get information through an incredibly complicated interagency bureaucracy, because they were tasked to sit side by side and make sure that happened. I was wondering if you could explain, first of all, a little more in layman's terms, what a fusion cell is and does, and secondly, why you think it might be useful to consider that operational concept in the context of what it's going to take to confront the pandemic and deliver the kind of equipment, the kind of testing and tracing, and eventually, we hope, the kind of widespread use of a vaccine that it's going to take to beat this thing.
Yeah. In war, the side that understands the most wins. And in today's world, the side that understands the most quickly wins. What we found in the counterterrorist fight, there are movies and you see these barrel-chested counterterrorists kicking open doors and doing heroic things. That's important. But what we found in our fight, that wasn't the difference. There are a lot of people who could do that. It was knowing where you had to go, knowing the threat, understanding yourself. What we developed in Joint Special Operations Command across 27 countries simultaneously was we had a need to synchronize the fight every 24 hours. So we had to understand what was happening in detail, literally all the time. So we created this network. We had people all out at 76 different bases and locations. We had teams in every one, and we connected them through a network of fusion cells. And what we found was when one piece of information found something, it was almost like a human body. If your hand touched the stove and it was hot, your entire body knew it immediately. You could take action. And we found with that network of people, we could pulse information, we could learn, we could react, we could share best practices. We could do all the things we needed to really, really quickly. Now we say that was war. Well, the fight against COVID-19 is very similar. Most of us, we wouldn't know a COVID-19 if we saw it. And the reality is we're all learning about this every day. Unfortunately, when we think about all the cities across America, the communities, they don't have the ability to have deep expertise. They don't have the resources to everybody learn on their own. What we need to do is be connected so that everybody learns. As soon as one locality learns something that's appropriate, it goes in. And we put the pieces of the puzzle together, and everybody sees the puzzle all the time. And when someone needs resources or someone needs help, that can be understood across the network, and it can be shared very, very quickly. This is a pretty small investment to make. And you say, well, we've all got cell phones. If we want, we could call someone. It doesn't work that way. You have to put a standing network with people who know how to pump that information to really put life into it.
Another concept that I know you have been a champion of for a long time is the concept of national service. And I want to ask about that in this context too. On one hand, it's been a lot tougher for people to maintain service roles. For example, thousands of people who were deployed overseas as civilian servants in the Peace Corps have been called back from the missions that they were working on. And a lot of kind of what we would usually think of as the things you would rush out to volunteer to do are obviously not possible at a time when we've got to stay physically apart. On the other hand, it strikes me that we are going to need people stepping up in all kinds of new ways. One thing that comes to mind is that there was a report that came out of the Safra Center at Harvard, which I think has done some really good work on mapping out what we're going to have to come up with by way of testing and tracing in order to actually safely reopen society. One of the things they mentioned is that we need something like 100,000 more people than we have now, just working on tracing the contacts of people who test positive. So that's one example of how we're clearly going to need to find new ways to engage a lot of human capacity at a moment when human capacity is also sidelined by the constraints of being in this emergency. I wonder how you thought about the idea of national service that you've spoken up for in so many ways for so long, and what it might look like to begin picturing national service in the context of the coronavirus response.
Yeah, well, you've obviously pressed my press to talk button here, and you and I have been sharing a passion for this a long time. So I'm going to start by giving just a little bit of background. If we go back to the Second World War, another existential threat, 12 million Americans were in uniform, but every American was contributing. They were rationing things, they were saving things, they were working in war factories. So everybody felt connected to the cause. During the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956, African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, boycotted public transportation. When they studied it after the fact, what they found is for 382 days, the African Americans in the community had to make a commitment every day. They had to walk to work, they had to carpool, they had to do something that was inconvenient to stay committed. What it did was it increased their commitment to the cause, because they were able to contribute, because it gives us a sense that we are shareholders in the outcome. I would argue that what's happened in America in the last 40 or 50 years is we're almost never asked to do anything except pay our taxes and vote, and we don't do that at a very high rate. Most of us got our citizenship by accident of birth. We didn't do anything for it. And that's actually unfortunate, because I think when you contribute to something, you suddenly have a different feeling about its value. And so I think the idea of citizenship is wrapped up in not inalienable rights, but in inalienable responsibilities as well to other Americans and more broadly to the world. So what it could look like here is key. What's the biggest frustration when we're all sent to work from home? We may work and someone says, well, what can I do to help? And people say, well, stay home, stay socially distanced. And although that's right, that's kind of not completely fulfilling. We want to do something. We want to actually help. I think if we had already organized national service for young Americans is what I've been focused on, but it really ought to apply to everybody. The ability to be in things like a health corps. What if we had a bunch of young people who'd gotten basic public health training, and then maybe they go into the equivalent of reserve, and when they need to be called, now we've got people who are all ready to help. Think about people helping with education. It's a lot. My 3 granddaughters live next door to me and their school's closed. So the reality is there's homeschooling going on, but none of us have been trained to be homeschoolers. And so what if we had a group of people who could help people do that? Right. You know, online things. the number of things you can do is extraordinary. And the real gift is what we do now, but long term, it changes your sense of being a citizen. If you do national service as a young person, whether it's military or AmeriCorps or Teach for America or any number, you vote at 3 times the rate of people who didn't do that. It has an effect. It changes us inside. So I would argue that this is an opportunity. In a crisis, there's an opportunity to mobilize people into all permutations of that, where we could get people mobilized and make people, when this is over, people are going to look in the mirror and they say, what did I do during the COVID-19 crisis? And if they can say, all I did was sat at home, it's going to be unfulfilling. But if they can look at their kids and say, this is what your mother and father did. We went out and did this, or any number of things. That's just my sense.
There's the idea of reciprocal loyalty, right? You do something for me and I become loyal to you. But I know there's also a lot of research that indicates we're actually most loyal, not based on what's been given to us, but the more we give, the more we feel connected to whoever or whatever we're giving to. It rhymes a lot with, I think, what you're describing, that the more we pitch into our community, to our country, the more deeply connected we feel, and perhaps the more we're ready to turn around and do even more than we had before. I know I certainly felt that in terms of the campaign organization that we built. When somebody came through the door of a field office or was willing to do just some little thing for the cause, they became more invested and then were more and more motivated and prepared to motivate others to often do more than they ever thought they would, but found it very rewarding as well. And since I'm treading into the subject of partisan politics, let me ask a question that came from Phoebe. She said, how can we remove partisanship from how people view leaders in America today? And I think about this a lot because as a mayor, I ran as a Democrat, but it was pretty important as a mayor not to be very partisan in my day-to-day approach. Worked with Republican governors, worked across the aisle whenever we could. A lot of mayors in the United States don't even declare a party affiliation when they run. Of course, running for president is very different. And I was in a Democratic primary. I'm a strong Democrat, and I believe in the values of my party for a reason. And I'm very energetically supporting Joe Biden for president. But I remember having warned that, whenever you put on the uniform, you've got to put that away. As a citizen, you don't stop having opinions. You don't stop thinking as a voter about who you prefer or having partisan views. And yet, as an officer, you've got to make sure that never is on your sleeve. I wonder, having spent the time that you did in uniform and being at the level of military leadership where you are interacting routinely, both with people who arrive by way of partisan politics and with people whose professionalism depends on them not saying a word about partisan politics in their jobs. What do you think are some lessons we can draw from that at a moment when we shouldn't pretend that we don't have loyalties to parties or strong ideological views, and at the same time are confronted with a crisis that is bigger than any party and that is going to affect every American, no matter how you voted last time?
Yeah, you're right. In my military career, we never knew the political leanings of fellow officers or senior NCOs. You didn't talk about it. It was just not seemly to do that. It was appropriate, because I remember being in a meeting one time when one of the guys said, a senior officer, he says, we can never be viewed as Republican generals or Democratic generals, because then we'll be a very different republic, and the military will have a very different role in our society, and not a good one. So I think that's true. I don't have the right solution to stop partisanship, because we've been going that way for several decades now. It has sped up. I think it goes back, though. We as voters have got to demand that people take a more middle of the road approach, or a more compromising approach. Doesn't mean you can't feel strongly as a liberal or a Democrat or whatever, but it means at the end of the day that the people on the other side aren't the enemy. They may be the opposition. And we've got to be able to operate in a way that says that if one party wins it, we're not going to try to destroy the other party when we're ascendant. One, because if you destroy the other party, you destroy the two-party system, and the entire premise of our national structure is threatened. But I think it has to begin with voters, and we need to be better consumers of information. I don't think we're demanding enough. You have a background in intelligence in the military. One of the first things you learn is someone brings you intelligence, you say, where did it come from? Let me vet the source. Let me decide its validity. I think we need to learn to do that with all the information we read and hear from every angle.
That makes me think of another connection that I thought was interesting recently, which is that the flow of information is changing for all of us. I mean, the simple fact that when we're connecting with loved ones, we may be more likely to do it this way through a device and a screen than when we used to do it in an in-person fashion differently. Of course, in the military, video teleconferencing has been around for quite a while, but still, I'm sure every kind of organization, business, public, and private sector is going through these changes. So someone named McKee online asked the question, how has your own leadership style changed during this period of social distancing? And it's not something I've really reflected on until now, but certainly, a lot of times I found as mayor that a big part of my leadership style, it really depended on being in a room with somebody. It was sometimes reading one another's faces when an idea is being proposed and you're with advisors. Sometimes I think a big part of how many executives lead is actually largely through the questions that they ask. So have you noticed any changes in your own approach to leadership as you run a team in a company? And as you answer the question, I'm getting some comments that our feed's blurry, so I'm going to try to to the viewer, but forgive me if it does as I switch antennas. Go right ahead, General.
Evolves with experience. Mine really changed the most when I was in Joint Special Operations Command and we were distributed, and we operated on video teleconference most of the time. Before, as a leader, you walk into the room and your presence, your nonverbal actions are part of your leadership. Whether you touch someone on the shoulder, you give them a thumbs up, you give them a smile, you communicate they're doing a good job, or if they're not, you communicate some disappointment. When we went to virtual, it was very awkward at first because everybody at both ends is awkward. A lot of people would say, my camera's not working. And of course, because they didn't want to be on camera. And we had to beat through that. And then I learned when you're on camera, you have to exaggerate your engagement. And what that means is you have to be focused. I can't be reading something. I can't be yakking with somebody else. It's disrespectful and it sends a really bad message to everybody who's on it. Similarly, I've got to try to get as much out of this medium as I can. I've got to try to read your face as best I can, and I've got to be able to send either my feelings or my enthusiasm through it more than I might have to in the room where they seem to flow more easily because we're used to that. I found that you also have to communicate clearly to people because you're on for a period of time, but there's no chance to walk down the hallway with you after the meeting and just ask you one more question. So you've got to be really clear about what you're trying to say. If you think they're not getting it, ask them, am I being clear? Read that back to me or whatever. And you also have to be upbeat because one of the things I found is particularly young people, I was a 50-plus-year-old general and young people would be giving me information or briefing me. And if I'm in a bad mood and I sit there, and even if I'm not ugly, if I just go, got it, it sends this really dismissive message to people. And I can't smile at them after the meeting or anything like that. So I learned that I've got to be really careful. In the command also, I had to learn little cues like sometimes I'd take my glasses off and I'd wipe my face. And the chat rooms would light up and they go, what's the old man mad about? Well, maybe the old man just needed to wipe his face. But I learned all of those things have disproportionate meaning. And so it's really important that we think about making this communication intentional and effective every opportunity we have.
It's almost like learning a new culture or language, right? In the same way that if you're engaging in a different culture where a hand gesture or a way of making eye contact might have very different meaning. Now we got to do the same thing even with fellow Americans, just knowing that the medium changes the way a lot of these things come across. It's a fascinating take. I knew you'd have some thoughts on that. Amazingly, we were already pressing up against our time. I promised that we wouldn't take make a claim on more than a half an hour of your time, but I'm really interested in another question that came in that I'm just sure you'd have a perspective on that's worth thinking about now. It's from Anita, and the question is for advice on how you balance advice from experts with your own gut, since you have to personally make a decision. And again, I think as we look at mayors, governors, and the White House right now, as we think about just the question of whether we're going to pay attention to expertise or not, and yet knowing that sometimes when you're in an executive, you got to listen to somebody who is perhaps even more intelligent than you and more knowledgeable than you in a particular field, and yet it's up to you, not them, and there may be a reason not to do what they recommend. What's your sense of how best to balance those things? And in particular, what should mayors, governors, or for that matter, private sector leaders or heads of household be thinking about right now when they're trying to weigh their own instincts and what experts have to say?
Yeah, it's funny you raise that, because we have to learn the same thing about just raw data as well, because data can be shaped so many ways. I learned something years ago from a guy who was a senior officer when I was junior. I said, how do you get briefed so many times during the day on subjects you don't know much about and judge whether it's right? And he says, I look at the briefer. I know I can't be an expert in that particular subject. And what I'm going to have is really the amount of information that that expert brings to me. And so he told me he had learned to do, and I think I tried, and most senior leaders did, you try to judge the credibility of the person. Now, if you know the person over time, they get a track record. And so you can do that more easily. If you're dealing with a group of experts or a single expert for the first time or very occasionally, you still almost look at them. You look at their confidence. You learn to ask questions that sort of get at their conviction to the information that they're given. But at the end of the day, it's an awful lot of your judgment. You learn to ask the best questions you can, but you can't just automatically do what people say. That's one of the reasons you're the leader.
You know, one of the things I always think about in elected office and other executive positions is, why did we decide to have a human being and not a rule or a formula or an algorithm making this decision? And I think so much of that is that quality of judgment that's difficult sometimes to describe or define. And to me, it has a lot to do also with understanding that the kinds of things that get escalated to senior leadership, they aren't always technical questions with technical right and wrong answers. A lot of times there are moral questions baked into those that there's just no way to automate that kind of decision making. And experts can bring you data, but they can't always bring you the right answer. Again, time has just flown by. I want to close with a question that came from a user named Smith, which is, what is the most crucial attribute one can have in a high pressure situation?
Yeah, character. And Pete, you just talked about it. I don't think it's courage. Integrity is wrapped in character, but that character means that when things are really tough, you have a core set of values that you are moored to and that you will not let go of. You may not be an expert on it. You may be frightened. You may all kinds of things. But if your character is your foundation, I think you're going to do about as well as can be done.
Great answer. And again, I'm so thankful that you took some time today. I think this is a great conversation and a reminder that America is full of great leaders, even if we're not seeing the leadership we wished we saw in some of the places we often look to. This is going to be just the beginning, I think, of America's response. And I remain, even though I think we're all clear-eyed about what we're up against, I remain hopeful that ultimately, as so many major crises have, this can bring out the best in us. Thanks again for taking time with us, and look forward to remaining in touch. And I know folks who've been following this conversation will enjoy following your commentary as well as you continue to be out there in the public sphere talking about service, talking about leadership, and talking about where we're all headed.
And thanks for all you're doing, Pete.
Pleasure to be with you. Take care. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, I certainly found that as enlightening as I'd hoped. I hope that was useful for you as well. And it's great just to see so many folks tuning in and a lot of people who are following the campaign too. We're going to be doing these conversations from time to time, a way to connect with people who I think have something to say that we could all learn from. And feel free to reach out or message us if you have ideas for people you think it would be good for us to be in touch. I love seeing a lot of comments as well about how we all need to come together, what we've learned from the campaign. I can't help but notice that a few of the comments are concerning this up here. So for those who are asking, yes, this is Chasten's work. We're doing the whole do-it-yourself thing. He warned me that if I asked him to get out the clippers and cut my hair, I might not like the result, but the price was right. And so for those who are wondering about the new look, that's the result of doing it yourself. And home haircuts are just one of the things that is changing, I know, for a lot of us out there. I want to encourage you, if you haven't yet, to visit wintheera.com. Make sure that we've got your email address so that we can be in touch on different efforts that we're up to through the Win the Era organization that we launched this month, a way to continue to carry forward the values that I know so many people were drawn to in becoming part of the campaign. And again, above all, I hope that you are staying safe, that you are looking after one another. And while I can't wait to be able to see so many of you in person one day, in the meantime, it's a real treat to be able to see you and interact with you virtually. Take care, be safe, and stay well.